Now I can check the caliper sliding pin. Pivot the caliper up so it clears the disc and the pin slides out of the bracket. Now in theory this pin should be clean and smooth and well greased, but as you can see this one is anything but. It's borderline whether to get a new one, and if this was my front caliper I would replace it without question. But as the rear caliper is much less critical, I'm going to clean this one up. To unbolt it though, I need to put the pin back into the bracket as it's quite tight. Just before I do that, I'll use my big pliers again to squeeze the piston back in. Again, check the fluid level is not too high and clean the piston first if necessary. A firm but gentle squeeze and the piston slides back in. With the pin fully back inside its hole, I can get my crack bar out again and undo it. Once it's unscrewed, I can just leave the caliper in place whilst I go and clean it up. As you can see, it's seen better days. Smoothness is the key though, not cosmetics. So a good wire brushing and a quick rub down with some wet and dry. I'll clean it off with some brake cleaner and then leave it to dry. It's crucial that you don't reduce the pin's diameter, as you could well stop it working properly. And this is what you should end up with: grease-free threads and a smooth sliding surface. Now just so I can show you where everything normally sits, I'll put the cleaned rubber boot back on briefly. As you can see, there's a lip on one side that sits inside the groove in the caliper bracket, and the other end sits in a groove on the pin. So when it's fitted, it forms a watertight seal and keeps greased and sliding. Our pin was corroded simply because the lip was not fitted inside the caliper bracket the last time it was put back together. I've cleaned the groove that the boot fits into using a tiny screwdriver, and using brake cleaner and a rag wrapped round another thin screwdriver, I've cleaned out the hole and made sure it's bone dry. The threads screw into the caliper itself. One end of the rubber boot sits in a groove on the pin, and the lip on the other end sits in a groove inside the caliper bracket. This keeps the water out and the grease in, and allows the pin to slide smoothly in and out of the bracket. But I'll take it off first to insert it in the bracket. Squeeze a bit of high temperature grease in there first, not too much as it will actually stop the pin going all the way to the end. Then fit the rubber boot into its groove, which can be slightly fiddly. I like to try the pin in the hole to work the grease around and make sure it's moving in and out as it should and not hydraulicking on the new grease. I'll take it out now and degrease it again. I've briefly put the lower caliper mounting bolt back on to show you the other part of the sliding mechanism. Now it's quite common for these sliding parts to jam up, and although this one does slide, its action is very notchy and it needs stripping and re-greasing. The inner bush is a metal tube with a rubber boot, this time seated on both ends of the bush. To get it out, use a small, blunt as possible screwdriver. Be warned, it's very easy to rip the rubber boot, especially if it's old. Peel one end over the top of the metal bush and then slide it out the other way. Again, this should be smooth and clean and greased, so it needs cleaning up in a second. Inspect the rubber boot for any holes or tears and replace as necessary. This one looks fine, but I'll make sure the inside is nice and clean before re-greasing. A quick wire brush and rub down with some fine wet and dry. This will destroy any metal plating, of course, but as it's going to get covered in grease and sits inside a rubber boot, it should be fine. It is 10 years old after all. With it nicely cleaned up and greased, it's ready to slide back in, which can be a bit tricky as the boot tries to roll up inside itself. You can use a screwdriver again if you want, or you can use the miracle of air pressure. By sealing the two ends up with your fingers and giving it a quick squeeze, it forces the rubber boot to expand and slide over the first groove in the metal bush. Then slide it all the way through until the rubber boot seats properly in both ends of the bush. Wipe the outside of the boot to stop the grease getting onto the pads, then slide the bush in and out a few times to work the grease around inside the boot and make sure it moves nice and freely. Next, dab a little thread locking compound on the caliper pin threads and screw it back in by hand into the caliper. We'll torque it up later. I'm putting the high temperature grease on now.